Thank you. I will address now the problem, the threat that a bad agreement on carbon trading, something that is unfortunately very likely to occur over the next few hours, will pose for human rights, both at the local and global level. The idea of carbon trading is not new. We have witnessed how carbon trading schemes function in practice for over a decade, for almost 2 decades under the Kyoto Protocol. Negotiations here seem to take place in a vacuum, but we know what are the consequences of carbon trading when adequate rules are not put in place. Those past experiences have demonstrated that carbon trading results in 3 different levels of harms for human rights, both locally and globally. First, carbon trading provides an incentive for project developers to promote projects in other countries, very often in countries that lack the norms, the governance that is required to prevent harms on local communities, on indigenous peoples. We have seen projects displacing communities without their consent for the sake of generating carbon credits. We have documented, and the United Nations itself has also done so, all of the harms, the breach of the violations of human rights obligations in Latin America, in the Caribbean, in Asia, in Africa, windmill farms that have kicked out of their land indigenous peoples just for the sake of generating additional profits. The development of monoplantations that have ruined ecosystem and also resulted in the forced eviction of many local communities. And in some cases, leaders and local farmers being assassinated in order to make room for those projects. We are speaking about very real-world threats to human rights. Second, the concept of carbon trading, its objective, its essence, is actually to continue sustaining the status quo in industrialized countries, avoiding to force certain industries out of business so that they can continue their business model without questioning their modes of operation. Due to this absence of questioning of business models, we have seen coal power plants in Europe, petrochemical factories in the south of the United States continue their operations, damaging the health of children around them because they know that they can rely on future carbon trading actually to continue their operation without being forced out of business. Third, we know that those mechanisms do not result in actual emission reductions. A study by the European Union revealed that the vast majority of credits exchanged in the previous scheme have not resulted, you cannot demonstrate that they have actually resulted in actual emission reductions. This means we are losing time, and as the IPCC report tells us, we do not have this luxury anymore. This means that communities most exposed to the harms resulting from climate impacts are actually seeing those harms accelerate just because we are developing these schemes that actually are not effective in combating climate change. So what do we need here? We have never asked as civil society, as indigenous peoples' organizations, for a carbon trading scheme under the Paris Agreement. If governments absolutely want to establish such a scheme, it is their duty to ensure that it doesn't undermine ambition under the Paris Agreement or the rights of communities and indigenous peoples. This means no double counting, no carryover of junk credits that come from the past, no an overall benefit for the climate. A zero-sum game under carbon trading doesn't help the climate in any way. It means effective and meaningful protection of the rights with the strictest safeguards and mechanisms to ensure that never the Paris Agreement's name can be used to harm communities. If governments cannot agree to this here in Glasgow, they must do what they did in Katowice, in Madrid. They must prevent an agreement, rather no deal than a bad deal that will stay for generations. In Glasgow, we've seen the most exclusive COP of the past decade. Many of the communities that could be impacted by those carbon projects are not here in the room. We were kicked out of the main building for the first 2 days to make room for decision makers. In those circumstances, this COP is even less legitimate than any previous COP to finalize rules that will stick for decades. Why am I insisting on sticking for decades? We know from experience that once a deal is done, there is no way to bring back governments who refuse human rights safeguards back to the table and increase and improve the rules. This means once a deal is done, it will stick for generations. So really, there is one simple question that we ask governments here in Glasgow, and we ask civil society and others, will we tolerate that the Paris Agreement be weaponized by corporate actors to place profits over the rights of local communities and the protection of the climate? We call on governments here to follow the leadership that a handful of countries demonstrated just 5 weeks ago when they created a process under the UN Human Rights Council to recognize the right to clean, safe, and healthy clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. Just a handful of nations led the way, and because of the power of the idea and the principles they were fighting for, they managed to gather consensus behind them. This is the type of leadership we need to see. But if governments fail to uphold their responsibility here, they will make themselves complicit for the human rights violations that we will see for the coming decades under the name of the Paris Agreement, and we must avoid this.